Story 1. An unknown caller saved my life. Some time ago, I decided to go on a little personal vacation out into the woods of northern Arizona. I was experiencing a sort of malaise that was messing with my creative flow, and I needed a chance to really knuckle down and enjoy the natural world again. I had spent 6 days out in the wilderness, just enjoying the feeling of being in nature, but the night of day 7 was one I will never forget. Noise. Something was waking me up. Groggily, I rolled over and looked at my phone. It was ringing. I looked to the top of it and blinked. No signal. That made sense. I had come out here for the isolation, a chance to clear my head and make some music again. So why was my phone ringing? How was my phone ringing? I stared at the number as my phone rang incessantly, an unknown caller. I heaved a tired sigh, swiped to answer, and croaked blearily, "Hello? You need to be ready. It knows you're there, and it's already here. It has come for you," came the voice on the other line. Who is this? Who am I speaking to? I asked, the exhaustion beginning to leave my voice. Be ready. It will be there soon. Don't open the door. The line went dead. My phone blinked and the words, "Signal lost," flashed on the screen. Don't open. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and wearily watched my phone, waiting to see if it would ring again. I must be losing it, I murmured, placing my phone back on the nightstand and rolling back over to go to sleep. That's when the house thundered. Booming knocks shook the glass of the windows and rattled the glassware. Jesus fucky. I spun to the door of my room and my mouth dropped. My door was closed, but it was shaking like something was trying to get in. Boom, boom, boom. 3 knocks in short succession thundered against my bedroom door. I didn't remember locking it. The only door I locked was the front. It was the only one I figured I needed to out here. The angered knocking came again. 3 strong blows, and the rattling began anew. It shook the door, and as I watched I saw the frame begin to crack. My phone rang, and the rattling stopped. Sparing a glance, I snatched it off the nightstand and looked at the number. Unknown caller again. Shakily, I swiped to answer the call and brought the phone to my ear, saying nothing. It knows you're in there. It isn't going to be polite for long. Get under the bed. Hide. Then, the line went dead again. Signal lost. I looked at the cracking doorframe and wasted no time taking this mysterious caller's advice. Quickly, I crawled under the bed and watched. It was only minutes. I knew it was only minutes, but it felt like hours. I stared at the door, terror wrapping its cold arms around my gut. My breathing became ragged as my eyes remained glued to the door. It wasn't moving. There was no knocking. Had the caller been wrong this time? Was it done? Had it just given up? What was it? Questions raced through my skull, each firing out of the cannon of doubt before the next one could be rationalized. Could any of this be rationalized, though? Something had called me up and warned me of something else in my house. Now that something else was just outside my door. I couldn't explain it, but I had this feeling. Like whatever it was that was out there was waiting for me to make a move. Like we were in some kind of terrible chess game. So I watched. I waited beneath that bed for agonizing minutes. The sounds began shortly after that. Soft scratching noises, almost inaudible from my position. The one my signalless savior alleged would keep me safe. I never let my gaze drift from the door, and I'm glad I kept it there because watching what happened next defied logic. The door itself began to bulge inward. I could hear the wood splintering as the center continued to bubble toward me. Then, it exploded. Debris and lethal wooden scrap fired throughout the bedroom. I wasn't spared when this happened. My hiding place provided shelter from the brunt of the door's destruction, but I was peppered with fragments of splintered wood that dug themselves into my skin. I wanted to cry out in pain, but the sight of what was beyond caught the scream in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, I saw a pair of feet. Massive legs that must have been at least 3 feet across themselves. But that wasn't the strangest thing. The skin was no tone I had ever seen on a human. It was this mossy green and brown, and the texture was so wooden, like a pair of tree trunks. Slowly, the thing in my doorway ambled its way into my room. I could hear its heavy, ragged breaths, like some sort of hunting beast. It was at the foot of my bed. The scent of moss and pine clung heavily to it, but there was another scent I caught as it just stood there. Rot. Death. The pungent odor of decaying meat clung to the creature's wooden legs. I had to cover my nose and mouth to keep from retching as it circled the bed. Was it going to throw it up and pull me out from underneath? Was this monster just waiting for the perfect chance to tear me to shreds? What the fuck was it? The feet turned, and suddenly my blood felt like ice. My whole body shivered as the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. I could see my breath as this thing let out an ear-shattering roar. I can't place the sound, but it reminded me of a mixture between a jet engine's roar and a grizzly bear's growl. I watched from my hiding place as the nightstand was lifted and launched across the room. I could only hear the thing shatter as the creature tore the place apart. My eyes were discs in my head, and my hands were clamped over my mouth to hide any sounds of breathing or whimpering. But just as it spun to face the bed, it stopped. Instead, whatever it was turned and shambled out of my room. What the fuck? What the fuck? They were the only words I could choke out as the creature disappeared from my sight. Then the phone rang again. Terrified, I seized it, trying to silence the ringer. I swiped to answer the caller and immediately began to whisper into the phone. What the fuck was that? Who are you? How the fuck did you know it was coming? There's no time for any of that. It knows where you are. You need to run. Jump out the window and keep running until you lose sight of this place. Keep going until you reach the highway. Don't come back until morning. Are you fucking kidding me? That thing is huge. I can't outrun it. You have to. It's the only way you win this. Then the call cut out. Signal lost. I steadied my breathing and psyched myself up, shooting out from under the bed as I heard that dreadful roar again. It was coming back. I didn't have time to think. No time to find shoes. I bolted toward the now shattered window and dove, slicing my arms and legs against the shards of glass. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, urging me to ignore everything else. I ran, bolted through the forest as fast as my legs would carry me. Twigs and rocks tore into my feet, but I kept going, even as my chest began to tighten and my lungs began to feel like there was a fire being set beneath them. I ran and I couldn't hear the monster behind me anymore. Maybe it stayed at my cabin. Maybe it kept looking elsewhere. Every ounce of me just hoped I had gotten lucky, but the voice on the phone told me to keep running until I hit the highway. So I did. I ran through miles of backcountry woods, never stopping, pushing myself far beyond anything I thought I was capable of, just to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. I could see darkness starting to push its way into my vision. My legs were beginning to feel like they were made of stone. My body ached and every muscle screamed for me to stop, but I kept pushing. When I burst through the tree line onto the road, I stopped. Almost instantly, I began sobbing and I dropped to my knees. I gazed up at the moon as my phone began to ring again. I pulled it out of my pocket and looked at the number. Before I could do anything else, darkness overtook me. I woke the following day in a hospital bed. Someone had discovered my unconscious and bloodied body on the side of the road. The sheriffs had a million questions, none of which I had a good answer for. They thought my story sounded like something I had made up, but when they went to the cabin, many of them were singing a different tune. "It looks like you got lucky and escaped one of the biggest bears I've ever seen," one of them said. "Didn't find it, but the claw marks in the wood made it look like a damn dinosaur. Grizzlies are huge, son, but not even they leave marks like that." When I asked about the phone calls, they just shook their heads. "There's no cell service that far out. You might have imagined that part in everything." It took me over a week to recover from my injuries. I was told I had lacerated a tendon in my right arm and that it had never quite functioned the way it had before. That was the arm I used to play guitar, and to this day, there are still certain notes my fingers just can't quite nail anymore. The day of my discharge, I was given the things that they had found me with and given an escort back to the cabin. The debris was mostly cleaned up by the time I arrived to collect my things, but the damage to the building itself was visible, and the cops were right. Whatever the hell it was that came after me that night must have been massive to leave the marks it did so deep in the wood. I checked my phone as I crossed the threshold of the house to gather my things inside. No signal. "Well, thanks, whoever you were," I muttered, gathering what stuff was left after the attack. To this day, I don't know who called me, or what it was that was in that cabin, but frankly, I don't think I want to know. Story 2. I never knew my great-grandmother. Now I wish I hadn't learned about her. I found the photograph among a pile of old, dusty albums in the attic. It had been years since I last ventured up there, and the nostalgia of my childhood was bittersweet. But as I flipped through the pages, a single photo caught my eye, sending a chill down my spine. It was an old, faded image of an elderly woman sitting in what looked like a dimly lit room. She was dressed in a pink shirt, her expression vacant and distant. Her eyes seemed to bore into the camera, or perhaps through it, with an unsettling intensity. I didn't recognize her, yet there was something disturbingly familiar about her face. I showed the photo to my mother, hoping she could shed some light on the mysterious woman. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She gasped, her face draining of color as she snatched the picture from my hands. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "In the attic," I replied, taken aback by her reaction. "Who is she?" My mother stared at the photo for a long moment before finally speaking. "That's your great-grandmother, Eleanor. We don't talk about her much. She had some issues." "What kind of issues?" I pressed, curious despite the growing sense of dread in my stomach. "She was institutionalized when I was a child," my mother explained, her voice hushed. "She claimed to see things, hear voices. They said she was schizophrenic, but she always insisted it was something else, something darker." I took the photo back, examining it more closely. The room in the background was shadowy, almost as if it was swallowing the light. There was a strange blur near her hand, almost like a motion blur, but more sinister, as if something was trying to escape the frame. That night, I couldn't get the image out of my head. I placed it on my nightstand, hoping that some sleep would help me shake off the eerie feeling. But as the hours passed, I found myself unable to drift off. The darkness in my room felt oppressive, the shadows lengthening and shifting in ways that defied logic. Around midnight, I heard a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent. I strained to make out the words, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the photograph. I turned on my bedside lamp, the sudden light blinding me momentarily. When my eyes adjusted, I saw the photograph had fallen to the floor, the image of Eleanor now eerily illuminated by the lamp's glow. The whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me. Picking up the photo, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background, behind Eleanor, there was a faint outline of a figure, almost invisible but definitely there. It sent a shiver down my spine. Was this what she had claimed to see? Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to do some research on Eleanor. The next day, I visited the local library and dug through old newspapers and records. What I found was chilling. Eleanor had been committed to the asylum after she attacked her husband, claiming he was possessed by a dark spirit. She became increasingly violent and paranoid, convinced that something was after her. Her claims were dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman, but the more I read, the more I began to believe there was something to her stories. I found her old journal, a small, leather-bound book filled with erratic handwriting. Her entries were a mix of lucid thoughts and frantic scribbles, detailing her descent into madness. She described seeing shadowy figures, hearing whispers in the night, and feeling an oppressive presence that never left her alone. One entry stood out to me. March 13th, 1956. The shadows are getting closer. They whisper my name, taunt me with promises of peace if I just give in. I see them in every corner, every dark place. They want me. I know it, but I won't give in. I won't. The more I read, the more I felt a creeping dread settle over me. The descriptions matched what I had been experiencing since finding the photo. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being watched. It was all too real. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to echo through my mind, filling me with a sense of impending doom. I clutched the photo, feeling a strange compulsion to keep it close as the hours dragged on. I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker than the rest, seemed to shift and pulse, almost as if it was alive. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it slowly take shape, forming into the figure I had seen in the background of the photograph. It moved closer, a black, amorphous shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. I could feel its malevolence, a tangible force that sent waves of fear coursing through me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized they were coming from the shadow itself. "Give in," it hissed, the voice a twisted, distorted echo. "Join us." I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. The shadow followed, relentless and unyielding. I felt a cold touch on my skin, a tendril of darkness wrapping around my arm. Panic surged through me, and I lashed out, my hand passing through the shadow with no effect. Desperation took hold, and I ran to the attic, the one place that seemed to hold any answers. I found the box of old albums and rifled through them, hoping to find something, anything, that could help. As I pulled out the albums, I noticed a small, hidden compartment at the bottom of the box. Inside was another journal, older and more worn than the first. It belonged to Eleanor, but the entries were different. They were written in a shaky hand, the words barely legible. October 31st, 1955. They came for me tonight. The shadows. They are real. I know that now. They took my husband. He is gone, and I am alone. But they won't stop. They want me. They will never stop. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I turned to see the shadow looming over me, its form twisting and writhing. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all urging me to give in, to surrender. In a moment of clarity, I realized what I had to do. I grabbed the photograph and the journal, and I ran to the backyard. The wind howled around me as I built a small fire, my hands trembling. I threw the photograph into the flames, watching as it curled and blackened. The shadows seemed to scream, a sound that pierced through me, and I knew I was doing the right thing. I tossed the journal in after the photo, the pages catching fire and burning away the darkness. As the fire died down, the whispers faded, and the oppressive presence lifted. I felt a sense of peace, a calmness that I hadn't known in days. The shadows were gone, banished by the flames. But the peace was short-lived. As I walked back inside, I saw a reflection in the window. Eleanor's face, her eyes filled with a silent warning. The shadows may have been gone, but the darkness remained, waiting for another chance. I knew then that this was not the end. The darkness had been a part of my family for generations, and it would not be so easily defeated. It was only a matter of time before it returned, and I had to be ready. The photograph may have been destroyed, but the shadows left their mark on me. I could feel them lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering their promises of peace. And deep down, I knew that one day, I would have to face them again. For now, I keep the journal close, a reminder of the darkness that haunts my family, and every night, as I lay in bed, I listen to the whispers, knowing that the shadows are always watching, always waiting. Story 2. Please don't whistle past midnight. I don't have much time. If you're reading this, please take my warning seriously. Never whistle past midnight. I made that mistake, and now it's coming for me. I can hear it getting closer with every second. About a month ago, I moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The locals warned me about strange occurrences in the area, but I shrugged it off as small-town superstition. Whistling has always been a habit of mine, something I picked up from my grandfather. It was a way to fill the silence and keep myself company. But after what happened, I regret every note. My wife got a fantastic job opportunity in Texas, so we packed up and moved into this big, beautiful house. It seemed perfect for us and our 2 daughters, Emily, who's 10, and Anne, who's 6. The house was at the end of a quiet street, bordered by thick woods that added a touch of tranquility to our new home. One night, I was up late working on my laptop. My job doesn't require me to be in person, so I often find myself burning the midnight oil at home. To keep myself entertained, I started whistling a tune my grandfather used to hum. It was past midnight, and the house was silent except for the tapping of my keys and the soft whistle of my tune. That's when I heard it, a faint whistling sound, almost like an echo, coming from outside. I stopped whistling and listened intently, but there was nothing. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired, and resumed my work. A few minutes later, I started whistling again, and this time, the echo was closer, clearer. I stopped once more, my heart pounding slightly. It had to be my imagination, right? The next morning, Emily mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Daddy, I heard you whistling outside my window last night. Were you there?" I tried to dismiss it, telling her it was probably just the wind or her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, I felt a gnawing unease. Over the next few nights, the whistling continued. Each time I heard it, it seemed to be getting closer and more insistent. One particularly unsettling night, I decided to stop whistling altogether, hoping to put an end to the strange echoes. But even after I stopped, the whistling continued, echoing through the house with a life of its own. It felt like a domino effect had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder and more persistent it became. Shadows began to move just out of the corner of my eye, and cold spots appeared in random places, sending shivers down my spine. The air in the house grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. My wife started complaining about the temperature fluctuations, and strange drafts seemed to come from nowhere. One night, as we were putting the girls to bed, and tugged on my sleeve with a worried look on her face. "Daddy, I heard you outside my window last night. You were telling me to come outside. Why did you do that?" Hearing this made the blood drain from my face. Her innocent eyes looked up at me, expecting a simple explanation, but her words sent chills down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced a smile. "Sweetie, I would never ask you to come outside at night. If you hear something like that again, don't listen. Just stay in your room and call for mommy or me, okay?" I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, and I hated that I couldn't give her a better answer. As I kissed her goodnight and turned off the light, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. The atmosphere in the house grew tense and heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down on us. It was as if something malevolent was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night was unusually cold, and despite my resolution to never whistle again after midnight, I awoke to the haunting melody piercing the silence. My heart raced as I recognized the tune. It was the same one I used to calm and when she couldn't sleep. Panic gripped me as I realized the whistling was coming from Anne's room. I stumbled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch as dread coiled in my stomach. The hallway felt longer than ever, shadows stretching and dancing ominously on the walls. When I reached Anne's door, my hand shook as I turned the knob. The room was bathed in an eerie blue glow from the moonlight streaming through the open window. The curtain billowed like a ghostly specter, and the whistling seemed to swirl around me, echoing off the walls. "Anne?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer but the incessant wind and the haunting melody. I rushed to the window and peered out into the darkness, praying to see her small form playing innocently in the yard. But the lawn was empty, bathed in an unsettling stillness that chilled me to the bone. "Anne!" I shouted into the night, desperation creeping into my voice. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized she was gone. A primal fear took hold of me, urging me to do something, anything to bring her back. Frantically, I searched the room, hoping against hope that she was hiding somewhere, playing a game. But the room remained silent, save for the mournful whistle that now seemed to mock my helplessness. With trembling hands, I dialed 911, barely able to speak as I reported my daughter missing. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness outside. I stumbled to meet them at the door, my voice hoarse with panic as I tried to explain what had happened. They listened gravely as I recounted the eerie whistling, Anne's disappearance, and the chilling silence that now enveloped the house. They conducted a thorough search, combing every inch of the property, inside and out. I watched with a sinking heart as they checked Anne's room, dusted for fingerprints, and scrutinized the open window where the curtains still swayed in the breeze. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of the officers muttered, his brow furrowed in confusion. "And no trace of the girl." "But she was here," I insisted, my voice pleading. "I heard the whistling coming from her room. It called her outside." The police investigation yielded no new leads, leaving us with a haunting silence and a home that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. After their thorough search turned up nothing, the officers suggested we stay in a motel to ensure our safety. Reluctantly, we agreed, packing a few belongings and leaving the empty house behind. The drive to the motel was tense. Emily sat in the back seat, silent and withdrawn, while my wife gripped my hand tightly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I tried to distract myself by turning on the radio, hoping the familiar strains of music would ease the suffocating dread that weighed on us all. But as soon as the radio crackled to life, the music abruptly cut off, replaced by a haunting whistle that seemed to emanate from the speakers themselves. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at my wife and daughter, both frozen in fear. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice trembling that I reached for the radio dial, frantically trying to change the station, but the whistling persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. It filled the car, drowning out the sounds of traffic and the hum of the engine. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized the whistling was not coming from the radio. It was coming from outside the car, surrounding us like a sinister presence. "Make it stop," my wife pleaded, her voice choking with tears. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape the haunting melody that seemed to follow us wherever we went. The motel loomed ahead, its neon sign flickering in the darkness like a beacon of false hope. As we pulled into the parking lot, the whistling abruptly ceased, leaving us gasping for breath in its wake. The air felt heavy and oppressive, thick with the lingering presence of whatever malevolent force had taken it from us. The air inside the cramped motel room hung heavy with the weight of our shared fear and grief. Emily lay curled up on one of the beds, her eyes wide and watchful despite her exhaustion. My wife and I sat on the edge of the other bed, our hands tightly clasped as we stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. "We need to stay awake," my wife whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. "We can't let it take Emily too." I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I won't let that happen," I vowed, my voice cracking with emotion. "We'll keep her safe." I glanced at Emily, who shifted uneasily in her sleep, her small frame shivering under the thin motel blanket. How could I protect her from something I couldn't even see or understand? The night stretched on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. We took turns patrolling the room, checking and double-checking the locks on the door and windows. The whistling had stopped for now, but its echoes lingered in our minds like a sinister lullaby. Hours passed in agonizing silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound of passing cars. My eyelids grew heavy with exhaustion, the weight of sleep pulling at me like a siren's call. Beside me, my wife fought to stay awake, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted. Just as I felt myself slipping into an uneasy doze, a faint melody began to drift through the room. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of tired senses and frayed nerves. But as the tune grew louder and more distinct, I realized with a sickening dread that it was real. The whistling had returned. I shot upright, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the room for any sign of the intruder. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "It's okay," I reassured her, though my own voice trembled. "Stay here with Mommy. Don't move." I crept toward the window, my hands shaking as I peered into the darkness beyond. The whistling seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us like a suffocating shroud. My wife joined me at the window, her breath catching in her throat as she listened to the haunting melody. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the whistling, "but it wants us to hear it." We stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, as the whistling grew louder and more insistent. It wrapped around us like a malevolent embrace, its eerie melody weaving through the walls of the motel room. As the haunting tune continued, I felt a strange drowsiness washing over me, pulling at my eyelids like lead weights. My wife swayed on her feet, her grip on my arm weakening. "We have to stay awake," she mumbled, her words slurred with exhaustion. But the melody seemed to have a hypnotic effect, lulling us into a false sense of security. Against my will, I felt myself sinking to the floor, my thoughts becoming sluggish and disjointed. "Daddy?" Emily's voice pierced through the fog in my mind. "What's happening?" I struggled to stay conscious, to fight against the overwhelming urge to sleep. But the melody whispered sweet promises of rest and relief, urging me to surrender. "Daddy," Emily called again, her voice tinged with desperation. Through half-closed eyes, I saw Emily standing by the door, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light of the motel room. Her eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy, it's calling me," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "No, Emily, don't listen." I managed to choke out, but my words were feeble and distant. The melody spoke with my voice, its words twisted and distorted into a haunting echo of my own. It promised safety and comfort, urging Emily to step closer, to open the door, to follow its call. I tried to move, to reach out to her, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. My wife lay motionless on the floor beside me, her breathing shallow and uneven. With a final, desperate effort, I forced myself to stand. "Emily, come back!" I shouted, but my voice was barely a whisper against the overpowering melody, and then, with a heartbreaking clarity, I watched as Emily reached for the door handle. The room seemed to spin around me as she stepped into the darkness beyond, swallowed by the haunting melody that had stolen my voice and my strength. I woke abruptly, gasping for air as I jolted upright on the motel room floor. The last thing I remembered was the haunting melody filling the room, lulling us into a dangerous stupor. My heart raced with panic as I scanned the dimly lit space. "Sarah," I called out urgently, scrambling to my feet. Beside me, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open with groggy confusion. What happened?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Emily," I choked out, fear gripping my chest like a vice. "She's gone." The realization hit us like a physical blow. Emily, our precious daughter, had vanished. The room felt colder, emptier than before, as the reality of our nightmare sank in. "We have to find her," Sarah said, her voice trembling with raw panic. Nodding grimly, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 once again, my fingers shaking as I recounted Emily's disappearance and our harrowing night at the motel. The operator's words were sympathetic but offered no immediate solace. Our daughter was missing, and time was slipping away.